And for the week ended 28th of February 2022, the AFEX commodity market summary was mostly red, with the number of deals down 9%. Also, volume was down. Well, to bring us up to speed, we have Michael Martin, portfolio manager at AFEX, to give us details. Great to have you, Michael. Good morning.
Hi, Ladi. Good morning. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Always great to have you. So give us a rundown of activities on the exchange.
Thank you very much, Ladi. So if you look at the commodity market summary, the total value of the total turnover of transactions on the exchange in the week under consideration fell by 75.54%, from around 3.89 billion to close to trading week at 0.95 billion. The total number of contracts traded on the exchange also fell by 80.89%, from around 12.27 million contracts to close to trading week at 2.34 million contracts. The total number of deals also fell by 9.81%, like you mentioned earlier, from 540 deals to close to trading week at 487 deals. The AFEX Commodities Index, which is the ACI, also fell slightly by 0.18%, from 481.87 points to close to trading week at 481.02 points. The AFEX Export Index, however, saw a marginal increase of 0.40%, from 194.75 points to close to trading week at 195.52 points. With regards to the volume of contracts traded on the exchange in the week under consideration, we generally saw a decline in comparison to previous week, with the biggest changes happening with maize, which fell from 5.86 million contracts to trade just 575,000 contracts this week. We also saw a big change with soybean, which fell from 4.36 million contracts last week to trade 1.26 million contracts this week. And lastly, with regards to volume, we also saw a big change with paddy rice, which fell from 1.40 million contracts last week to trade just 801 contracts this week. With regards to the price changes on the exchange, the biggest gainers in the week under consideration was sorghum, which went up by 3.26% to close the trading week at 234.96 naira per kilogram. We also saw a big change with cocoa, which went up by 1.74% to close the trading week at 1,272 naira and 20 kobo per kilogram. And lastly, with the biggest gainers, we saw paddy rice, which went up by 1.20% to close the trading week at 230.72 naira per kilogram. And with the biggest losses, we had maize, which fell by 6.36% to close the trading week at 226.47 naira per kilogram. And lastly, we have soybean, which fell by 1.81% to close the trading week at 401.74 naira per contract. So those are largely some of the biggest changes that we saw on the exchange in the week under consideration. And as we always mention, if you want to know more about the commodities market, you can always download our app, which is available on iOS and also on Android, and you can get started trading commodities.
All right, thanks for that, Michael. But since we're not seeing much price movement with commodities on the exchange, is there any reason for that?
Yes, there is. So around this time period is when you'd ideally see most processors staying away from the market. And that's largely due to the fact that most of them have already taken most of their inventory position at the beginning of the season, usually around the month of November, December, and then maybe even the earlier parts of January. So the month of February and March are where you then see the activities of these processors, who are the biggest buyers in the market, slow down significantly before they then begin to enter the market again, let's say between the Q2, the second quarter and the third quarter of the year.
All right, and today it seems the fuel scarcity is still with us. What can we expect for commodity space if, this actually continues?
Not a lot, to be honest, because in terms of direct contribution to the commodity prices, it has very little in terms of a direct correlation. Where we are most likely and have seen changes in recent weeks is with the logistics prices. So we are seeing some of the logistic partners that we have on the exchange charge a higher, amount in terms of having to move those commodities from one place to another. And of course, that has an effect for processors who may or may not need to have those commodities delivered at their preferred location, from time to time. So in terms of direct contribution to the commodity price itself, very little to no effect. But in terms of its contribution to the logistics price, we tend to see a lot of changes in the logistics prices.
Right, and it does have a massive impact on me. I don't have fuel, Michael. I don't know about you, but let's hope it ends soon, though.
It took me a while to get mine yesterday.
I can imagine. All right, Michael, thank you so much. All right, part two of the AFEX commodity update. We see Russia and Ukraine are deeply embedded in the world's agricultural and food markets. Present Ukraine-Russia situation has an influence on prices of crude oil, commodity prices, most especially wheat, and even the financial markets. For analysis now, we have Yusuf, who's going to be head structuring and origination at AFEX, joining us. Great to have you, Yusuf. Good morning.
Good morning, Ladi. Nice to be here again.
Yeah, so could you provide some, context on the magnitude of the probable uptick in global and local grain prices, as a result of this crisis?
Thank you, Ladi. First of all, these are very difficult times, and our sympathies with all the people involved. We pray this doesn't get more serious. It gets de-escalated pretty soon. But then going back to your question, Russia, Ukraine, the entire Black Sea region is very critical to the global agricultural commodities market, very importantly for commodities like wheat and corn, right? So these countries combined contribute almost 25% in the case of wheat, and I think about 17% in the case of corn to the global supply, and they are massive exporters, right? So if you have these supplies taken away from the global market, you can then have a sense of where we are going to in terms of prices. Already prices are about 22% up for corn already in the international commodity, on the international commodities exchanges, and then you also have price of wheat about 29%, if I'm not mistaken. So that tells us where we see this going. And the funny thing is, these two commodities are pretty important, are very important to the lives of a lot of people. They are staple commodities, basically. So you can then think of the ripple effect you can then see across the world. The last time this kind of thing happened, we saw the Arab Spring Revolution come up. So this time around, we hope the governments have enough of inventories to release to complement whatever they're able to import. That's on the agricultural commodities side. Then you then have the case of fertilizer as well. This same region, Russia and Ukraine, they contribute significantly to the what we call the urea and the potash market. And if these commodities, urea and potash, are very critical to what we consume in Nigeria, in the case of NPK 2010-10 and NPK 15-15-15. And what we are beginning to see already, in addition to what we've seen over the year 2021, is that fertilizer prices are going through the roof. The fertilizer index of FAO is already at its all-time highs, and what we see is that by the time these prices are transmitted to countries like Nigeria, farmers will have to bear a bit of the brunt in terms of price changes. So price changes clear. Wheat, corn, and fertilizer are the most impacted commodities in this case.
Yeah, quite an incredible ripple effect there. But you see, wheat prices have risen by more than a fifth since the start of the year to near 10-year highs, while maize prices have risen about, 15%, as you said. But these are the two most consumed grains, in Nigeria. What do you see, happening to local farmers and consumers?
So in the wheat market, you can see a direct relationship between the international market and the domestic market when it comes to wheat, because we barely produce up to 5% of what we consume. So the bulk of it is imported. So wheat is a direct transmission into the Nigerian market. So you see flour millers experiencing higher cost of goods sold, and they would very likely transfer that to the final consumers, which is you and me and you. We buy the bread, we buy the pastries, we buy all the confectionery. So we pay for all of these things eventually. So at the end of the day, the wheat prices would be transmitted almost one-to-one to the domestic market. For corn, however, we still have a bit of a barrier in transmission of prices between the international market and the domestic market. Already the domestic market is on a 4-year high, if I'm not mistaken, and that means that we're already at a very high level. But what we see is that international prices don't really transmit to the domestic prices because of some trade policies that we have in the country, and that might mitigate the transmission of maize prices, the international corn prices to the local market. However, notwithstanding the fact that international prices cannot be transmitted easily to the domestic market, we still think that corn prices in the domestic market will face some pressure going forward. As Michael said earlier, we now have a situation where processors are staying away from the market now. That's why we see the calmness and the decline in activity. But once these processors come back to the market, you see prices continue to move upwards again. So that's just it. Wheat prices can be transmitted one-to-one, but corn prices might face a bit of a challenge being transmitted because of domestic trade policies.
We might have to bump up our own wheat production at this point. But the crisis has also aided further rise in prices of natural gas, the main ingredient of fertilizer. Is this something we should be worried about, ahead of the planting season?
Yeah, I think we should be paying attention to it going into the next production season. Some indicative prices that I hear of about fertilizer in the market is that we might be seeing about at least a 50% rise in the cost of fertilizer going into the next production season. And if you think about how that would affect your cost of production, given the fact that fertilizer might be one of the inputs that contributes the most to production cost, you can then have a sense of where commodity prices will be at the end of the year when we harvest these commodities. So natural gas prices going through the roof almost 6 times in Europe, about 2 or 3 times in some other parts of the world, would also contribute to increased fertilizer costs across the world as well, and including Nigeria. So production costs going into the next production season is expected to be about, for fertilizers, expected to be at least 50% higher, going by what we see in the market. And it's not just peculiar to us, it's across the world.
And if I remember correctly, I know somebody actually predicted some commodity super cycle for 2022. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but is there any course of action that the government or private sector stakeholders in agriculture should take right now?
Yeah, let me just add a bit of comment to your super cycle narrative. So, to be honest, the super cycle is established. At first, I for one was contesting the argument around the super cycle, given the fact that we had not seen the elements that were required to validate a super cycle argument. But then, as of now, it's fully established. Kudos to the guys that saw it coming. But then we're in a super cycle, clearly. The second thing is that in this kind of instances, there's no other option than for government, private sector players to double down efforts to come into this market and see how they can contribute to solving some of these problems. Already, the federal government of Nigeria is doubling down some efforts in the production of wheat so that we can increase domestic production of wheat and balance that, try to at least balance the deficits that we have. We also need to do some of this for some other commodities like corn, maize, going into the next production season. And for us in AFEX, we've always held this perspective, because we believe there are so many deficits situations across the agricultural value chains, and there's nothing we can do other than contributing our quota to the best of our abilities in advancing these value chains. Already we are partnering with the federal government of Nigeria in producing wheat and in increasing wheat production. The dry season input farming is also, the dry season farming for paddy rice is also ongoing. We have some activities going on there. We are also preparing for the wet season production that will be looking at maize, sorghum, paddy rice, ginger, and all of these commodities. So for us, we all need to put our hands on deck and contribute what we can to this value chain. Otherwise, we already see about excess of 20% food inflation in Nigeria. We might actually be looking at more going into the next harvest season if we don't act now. We still have some window, so I think it's nice for us all to contribute our quota and act now.
Yes, and we do surely hope for peace in the world. Thank you so much, Yusuf Ogunvi, Head Structuring and Origination at AFEX. Thank you so much. Take a moment now.